Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be taking a look at Sicilian with e4, c5, knight f3, pawn to d6, d4, cd4, knight d4 begins the open Sicilian. Knight f6, knight c3, we're going to have a6 beginning the Najdorf. Then we're going to have this line bishop to g5. We're going to have e6, pawn to f4, bishop e7. We're going to have queen f3, and then we're going to have queen c7 to prevent bishop to c4. We're going to have castles queenside, knight on b to d7, and then we're going to have g4 going into maybe the most aggressive line that white can play against the Najdorf Sicilian. And we're going to be going over some of the modern tries that black can try to maybe take the game into slightly different territory than the old tried and tested old main lines, which maybe you're not getting a whole lot out of, or maybe you're a little uncomfortable with the black pieces. So we're going to take a look at these modern tries and see if they're worth a shot. So if you like content like this, please click on that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So for starters, when we're going over kind of the modern lines, we need to kind of decide, like, at what point do we deviate? At what point can we deviate? So the main things that I was looking at when I was looking at these modern lines was, okay, we play b5, and then after bishop f6 and knight f6, g5, knight d7, f5. Can we deviate with, instead of bishop to g5 or knight c5, can we deviate with something else? And one of the modern things that's been tried recently is this move castles kingside. And that's going to be one of the primary focuses of this video, is taking a look at this move castles kingside and what the merits of it are. Another thing to take a look at, which is kind of interesting, is I didn't even realize this was a possibility. But b5, bishop f6, it is actually possible to play bishop takes f6. So, I mean, this gets an interesting side note. Now, when I was younger, I just thought this move was completely impossible. And actually, to be fair, I thought the move castles kingside was also completely impossible. So, like, back in the 90s and early 2000s, when I was going over these lines, and I was playing these things with the black pieces, both of these things that we're looking at today, I really didn't think were even playable. Bishop f6, for a pretty obvious reason. It looks like bishop takes b5 should just be winning. Because, like, if bishop takes b5, a b5, knight on d takes b5, this is game over. I mean, we're hitting the queen and we're hitting here. That should be all she wrote, because after we take with check, we're pushing, and then we're going to be attacking that, and we're going to be attacking that. It's death. I mean, there's no surviving bishop takes b5. But what was interesting is, when I was looking at different possibilities for deviations, when I was looking at making this video, bishop takes f6 is sort of a possibility, because you can meet bishop takes b5 with just like rook b8, and you can just choose not to take that bishop. However, I really do think that just bishop d7, and then simply g5 should be, major advantage white. I don't think black has enough in terms of the open files to compensate for the pawn. I think black is just down a pawn here, and I don't think there's anything special going on. As a matter of fact, I don't really think black has anything better than just playing bishop takes d4 in a position like this, and I feel like black doesn't really have a whole lot, so I feel like this is still just major advantage white, just basically with the simplest possible response. But this kind of came out to me as something that was maybe a little bit more possible than I thought, because I never thought, hey, we could just sacrifice the pawn on b5. It's kind of an option. So that brings me back to this other option, which I think is going to be the primary focus of this video, is bishop f6, knight f6, g5, knight d7, f5, and now instead of knight c5, which was Fischer's move, and bishop g5, which is the move that everybody pretty much played throughout the 80s and 90s, we have this move, castles kingside. So this move is super interesting. I'm actually following two games here, and it's actually kind of relevant that I'm following two games. I'm following Shirov versus Hashembeth, and I'm following Guri versus Grishchuk. The Guri versus Grishchuk game was the most recent. It was played in 2020, and the Shirov game was played back in 2012. So both kind of recent. Now, what's interesting about the Shirov game is when I initially looked at this position, and I said, castles kingside, this can't be right, because obviously white can just crush black with the move pawn to f6. Well, that's exactly what Shirov did when he was faced with this. Shirov just immediately played f6 and said, okay, well, maybe I can just crush you. And it's a really good question, like, can white just crush black with pawn to f6? So the computer doesn't seem to think so. The computer seems to think black is okay. But it's a really dicey line. It goes gf6, gf6, knight f6. And already I'm looking at this position, looking at the wide open king and looking at all the threats. I'm very skeptical of black's position. So the Shirov game continued. Shirov played e5, which is Makes a lot of sense. Looks correct to me. We have d takes e5, and then we have knight to c6. Again, usually aggressive moves are correct. And then in the Shirov game, Shirov won pretty much instantly when his opponent played the move king h8, which turned out to be a huge blunder because simply knight e7, queen queen takes rook is decisive advantage white. The queen is, easily escaping. For example, if bishop b7, queen a7, and you don't have bishop takes rook because the queen on e7 is hanging. So it's clearly a big material advantage here for white. White easily went on to win this game. So what is the correct move? Well, after knight c6, apparently the only correct move is bishop b7. And then, according to my engine, I have queen to g3 check is correct to break the pin, and then you pick up the pawn on e5. So now we have really a series of almost forced moves. You have the rook on h1 hanging, and there's a lot of stuff hanging for both sides. I mean, knight g6 check is a threat. So there's this queen hanging. It's a very unclear position. So the computer's giving bishop d6 here, and then of course we should just stack. We should play rook takes d6, because obviously, again, if queen takes d6, we have this knight to g6 check, which would be picking up the queen, so we're going to have to go with bishop takes rook. And then again, we have sort of this forced move. We have rook to d1, which again unleashes this potential threat, knight g6, and it also puts a threat against this bishop. We're going to be threatening this bishop at some point. So black needs to hold his queen somehow, either with rook a7 or rook c8. I picked rook c8 because it looks more logical than rook a7, although the computer didn't seem to think it made any difference at all. And I think it's mostly just because it's looking at this forced perpetual from white way down the road, which, again, this is stockfish. So this is like, how do you even do this? So bishop d3, and then, again, the computer thought every bishop retreat was the same. It was looking at bishop d5. And basically the reason it thinks everything is the same is because it thinks white should essentially force what amounts to a perpetual check here, because white is down an exchange. Now, that being said, white has a lot of compensation for that exchange in terms of black's open king and a lot of other stuff going on. But apparently you're forcing a sort of a perpetual just after queen g5. There's nothing better than knight e4, knight takes e4, f5, knight to d6, and again, computer line, I know it's like, all these moves probably require like a mountain of explanation, which I'm not prepared to give. Queen to d6, knight g6 check, takes, and then we have perpetual. So that's kind of what the computer was looking at. And that's the main difference. It didn't see any difference in some of black's moves, like whether it retreated to d5 or a8. It didn't see much of a difference between any of those retreats because it thought white's best attempt was to take this perpetual. So according to the engine anyway, that's how the theory is sitting on this move pawn to f6. Is when white plays this move pawn to f6, we can apparently take, and if we play everything absolutely correctly beginning here with bishop to b7, we should be coming out of the woods with perpetual. As you can see, there's a lot of pitfalls here, and it's also a little questionable if white can't deviate, if white can't do something different to try to play for a win. And that might bring into question maybe if it does make a difference what some of black's moves are, like if there is a big difference between rook a7 and rook c8, or if there is a big difference between bishop d5 and bishop a8, if we can find some way for white to try to play for a win. But, of course, this isn't the option that disturbs me. The option that kind of disturbs me playing this with black is if we follow the main line from that Guri versus Grishchuk game, which continued rook g1. So rook g1 is kind of scary. Now, in the Guri versus Grishchuk game, Grishchuk played b4, which I think you absolutely should play b4 here, because knight d5 is not possible. And in general, when knight d5 is not possible, you want to play b4. You want to dare white to play knight d5. Because in this case, if knight d5, we simply have e5, e5, knight e5 should be decisive advantage black. We're bringing that knight to the defensive post with tempo. And when we do that, we're holding together our whole king side. And there is no way white is going to have enough compensation for the knight that he just sacrificed. So knight d5 is not possible, so we're looking at knight on c to e2. And then after knight on c to e2, we're looking at pawn to e5, because we do have to take the pressure off of the e6 square, and we also have the threat of pawn on f5 to f6 that we have to deal with. And the only way to deal with kind of all of these threats is to play pawn to e5. And so this is still following Guri versus Grishchuk. We have pawn to f6, e takes f4, e takes d4, f takes e7, rook to e8, knight to d4, knight e5, queen f4, and I'm just calling this position unclear. So from that sense, if we just look at this position kind of in a vacuum by itself and just call it unclear, of course, we should play this with black. I mean, this is just a big improvement on the old main lines. However, I have a lot of serious doubts about this position. I think white's better. And I think white's probably clearly better. Because it's hard for me to find a move here. And that's a real problem. Like, even if I just follow the Guri versus Krishchuk game, and I say, okay, a5 is what happened in that game. That game continued with a question mark move, bishop to b5, and then, play proceeded from there. But if just knight f5 here, the engine already gives major advantage white. Just knight f5, bishop f5, e takes f5, say rook e7, we're going to have something like rook g2, pawn to g6, f6, rook e6, pawn to h4, should be major advantage white. White is going to have a huge attack against that black king, and he's already got a huge clamp on these dark squares. This is a very frightening position, and the outpost on e5 does not seem to compensate for all of these problems. So that's scary thing number one. Scary thing number two is, okay, if I admit that a5 is not a great move, and I try to come up with some other move, and let's just say that I grab the engine's top pick, let's say bishop to e6. How does this turn out if I go a couple moves deep? Well, we're looking at knight e6, f e6, rook to g2, rook takes e7, makes sense, rook on g to d2, which the engine still gives as slight edge white, although the engine has a big problem with assessing this position. But let's just look at the position and think about it logically. I mean, logically, we still have a lot of weaknesses here with black. We have this weakness on e6. These pawns are not particularly all that great. White's position is compact. All of his pieces are active and doing something good, and all of his pieces are attacking sort of weak squares. So that's going on. So what does black have to compensate for the fact that white's position overall is just more cohesive and less messy? Black has this knight on the e5 outpost, and potentially at some point black has a little bit of counterplay on a couple of these open files, on the f8 file and of course on the c4 file. So what does this all come out to? Like, if we go a couple moves ahead, like if we just say, okay, let's just take a look at let's look at some computer top moves, we could have something like queen c5, and this is actually just to defend the knight after rook takes d6, and then we could have rook f8 kicking the queen back to d2, knight f3, and then we go after all these pawns. We play like queen g5 check, and we take this pawn. Now after bishop e2, again, the computer just gives slight edge white. Now this is really interesting and sort of concerning, considering that the computer is giving slight edge white, but white has 1, 2, 3, 4 pawns, and black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns. It means the computer is saying that white has enough compensation for at least a pawn and a half for the one pawn that it's down. And I would say that has to be, at the very least, accurate. Because, this knight is cut off. This knight on the h2 square is cut off. It doesn't have a clear way to get back. With this bishop on e2, this knight is cut off, and it doesn't have a clear way to get back. So there's no clear path to get this knight out of here. Another thing is these pawns are just objectively weak. You have these pawns that are weak on, b4, a6, e6, etc. So we have to consider that this position is probably slight edge, not just slight edge white, but maybe even as much as major advantage white in another couple moves. This is a really hard position to continue to play from here if you're playing the black pieces. And I don't know if I'm brave enough to play a position like this with black. I don't know if I can solve all of my problems. I would much rather have white's position here. I would much rather have the compact structure with no problems than have black's position where I have all of this messy pawn structure and this big mess that I have to try to solve, and if I survive, then maybe somehow I'm okay. I'm still not sure how I'm even getting the knight out without creating additional issues. Like, do I retreat it to g4 and then play h5, and if I play h5, I'm creating additional weaknesses on my king side. How do I defend e6? Do I defend e6? I mean, there's so many things here that I have to figure out, so many problems that I have to solve. I would just much rather have white's position. White seems like he's in fairly safe territory. So, I mean, just in conclusion, this move, castles kingside, it's certainly an interesting attempt. This move, castles kingside, But I don't know if it's any better than the old moves. I don't know if it's any better than just trying something like bishop g5 or knight c5, and then just knowing the theory really, really well and getting to a position that maybe you know is a draw. Working it out to where you can equalize, maybe in a very difficult way, but I have a little bit more confidence in the positions. The positions are a little bit more clear. So anyways, I hope you found that video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.